Maya Rodriguez walked into the community college classroom 5 minutes early, just like she did every Tuesday and Thursday morning. She carried her old backpack that had seen better days and a notebook she'd bought from the dollar store. The music appreciation class was her last requirement to finish her basic certificate program. At 34 years old, she never thought she'd be back in school. But life had a funny way of changing direction when you least expected it. She chose her usual seat in the back corner. Away from the younger students who always seemed so confident and talkative, Maya preferred to blend into the background. She'd gotten good at being invisible over the years. It was safer that way, less complicated. The classroom slowly filled up with other students. There was Linda, a grandmother in her 60s who wanted to learn about classical music. There was Tyler, a 20-something guy who needed the art credit for his business degree. There was Patricia, a nurse who thought music might help her relax after long hospital shifts. All of them seemed so normal, so comfortable in their own skin. Maya pulled out her cheap pen and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She'd filled 3 notebooks already this semester, writing down everything Professor Johnson said during his lectures. She didn't want to miss anything. This class meant everything to her, even though she'd never told anyone why. Professor Johnson walked in carrying his usual stack of papers and his coffee mug that read, "World's Best Teacher." He was probably in his 50s, with gray hair and glasses that he constantly pushed up his nose. He had a reputation for being tough but fair. Maya had heard other students complain about his high standards, but she didn't mind. She dealt with much harder things in life than a demanding teacher. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Johnson said as he set his things down on the desk. "I hope you all finished reading Chapter 12 about the Romantic period composers. Today we're going to talk about something that might make some of you nervous." Maya felt her stomach tighten. She didn't like surprises. Her life had taught her that unexpected news was usually bad news. "Your final project for this class will be a practical demonstration of what you've learned," the professor continued. "Each of you will perform a piece of music on the piano. Don't worry if you've never played before. I'll assign pieces based on your experience level." The room filled with nervous chatter. Linda raised her hand. "Professor Johnson, I've never touched a piano in my life. How am I supposed to perform anything?" The professor smiled. "That's exactly why I'm matching the difficulty to each student's background. Some of you might play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with one finger. Others might tackle something more challenging." Tyler groaned. "I can barely whistle a tune. This is going to be a disaster." Maya sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She stared down at her notebook, hoping the professor wouldn't notice her. She'd become an expert at making herself small and unnoticeable. It was a skill she'd developed out of necessity. "Let me go around the room and talk to each of you about your musical background," Professor Johnson said. He started with the students in the front row, asking about piano lessons, musical instruments they'd played, or even if they sang in church choirs. Most students admitted they had little to no musical experience. Linda had sung lullabies to her grandchildren. Tyler had tried to learn guitar in high school but gave up after 2 weeks. Patricia had taken piano lessons as a child, but hadn't touched the keys in 30 years. Maya watched the professor work his way through the classroom, getting closer to her corner. Her heart started beating faster. She could feel sweat forming on her palms. She tried to think of what to say when he reached her. The truth was complicated. Too complicated to explain in a few words. How could she tell him about the hours she'd spent practicing as a child? How could she explain the competitions, the performances, the pressure that had nearly broken her? How could she describe the way music had once been everything to her, and then became the thing she'd run away from? She couldn't. It was easier to lie, safer to pretend. "And what about you, Maya?" Professor Johnson stood in front of her desk now, looking down at her with kind eyes. "Any musical background I should know about?" Maya looked up briefly, then back down at her hands. "No, sir. I've never really done anything with music. Maybe heard songs on the radio, but that's about it." It wasn't entirely a lie. She hadn't done anything with music in years. She'd locked that part of herself away so completely that sometimes she almost believed it had never existed. Professor Johnson nodded and made a note on his paper. "That's perfectly fine. We'll start you with something simple." Maya felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because she'd avoided complicated questions. Sadness because denying her musical past felt like denying a part of her soul that had once been so alive. After class, Maya walked to her beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot. She had to get to work at the Rainbow Diner, where she'd been a waitress for the past 3 years. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and let her support her 16-year-old daughter, Zoe, and help take care of her mother, who lived with them in their small apartment. As she drove to work, Maya thought about the piano performance she'd have to do. Part of her was terrified that she'd give herself away. If she played too well, people would ask questions. Questions led to conversations about the past, and the past was something she'd worked hard to leave behind. But another part of her, a part she tried to keep buried deep inside, felt a tiny spark of excitement. It had been so long since she'd touched piano keys, so long since she'd felt music flow through her fingers, she missed it more than she allowed herself to admit. Maya pulled into the diner's parking lot and sat in her car for a moment. She looked at her hands resting on the steering wheel. They looked like ordinary hands now, a little rough from years of waitressing work. Nails kept short and practical. No one would guess that these same hands had once danced across piano keys with the precision and grace of a trained virtuoso. She shook her head and got out of the car. Those days were over. She was just Maya Rodriguez now, a single mom trying to make ends meet and finish her education. She wasn't the girl who used to play in concert halls. That girl was gone, and Maya intended to keep it that way. But as she tied her apron around her waist and prepared for another shift of serving coffee and burgers, she couldn't quite shake the memory of how it felt to make music. And despite her best efforts to forget, her fingers began to unconsciously tap out a familiar melody on the diner counter. The piano performance was still weeks away, but Maya already knew it was going to change everything. She just didn't know how much. The following week, Professor Johnson walked into class with a stack of sheet music under his arm. Maya felt her stomach flutter with nervous energy. Today was the day he would assign their pieces for the final performance. "All right, everyone," he said, setting the papers down on his desk. "I've selected pieces for each of you based on our conversations last week. Remember, this isn't about being perfect. It's about showing that you understand the musical concepts we've discussed this semester." He started calling students up one by one. Linda got a simple folk song called "Mary Had a Little Lamb" that she could play with just one finger. Tyler received "Happy Birthday" with basic chord accompaniment. Patricia got a simplified version of "Amazing." Grace, since she'd mentioned having some childhood piano lessons. Maya watched each student receive their assignment with a mixture of relief and nervousness written on their faces. The pieces all seemed manageable for beginners. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. "Maya Rodriguez," Professor Johnson called. Maya walked to the front of the classroom, her legs feeling unsteady. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her worn sneakers as she approached his desk. Professor Johnson looked at her over his glasses. "Since you mentioned having no musical background, I thought I'd give you something that would challenge you appropriately." He handed her a piece of sheet music. Maya's eyes widened as she read the title, "Minute Waltz in D-flat Major by Frédéric Chopin." Her heart nearly stopped. The Minute Waltz wasn't a beginner piece. It wasn't even an intermediate piece. It was one of Chopin's most technically demanding compositions, requiring years of advanced training to play properly. The rapid passages, complex fingering, and precise timing made it a challenge even for experienced pianists. "Professor Johnson," Maya said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you sure this is the right piece for me?" He smiled in a way that seemed almost dismissive. "I know it looks complicated, but I believe in pushing my students. You have 6 weeks to learn it. That should be plenty of time to figure out the basics. You don't have to play it perfectly. Just do your best." Maya stared at the sheet music in her hands. The familiar notes and symbols brought back a flood of memories she'd tried so hard to suppress. She could almost hear the piece playing in her head, could almost feel her fingers moving through the challenging passages. "But sir," she tried again, "maybe something simpler would be better. This seems really difficult." Professor Johnson's expression became slightly impatient. "Maya, I've been teaching music for 25 years. I know what I'm doing. Sometimes we grow the most when we're pushed outside our comfort zone. Trust me on this." Maya looked around the classroom. Her fellow students were already examining their simple pieces, some of them humming along with melodies they recognized. She was holding music that would challenge a conservatory student. "Is there a problem?" Professor Johnson asked, his tone suggesting that continued questions wouldn't be welcome. Maya shook her head quickly. No, sir. No problem. She walked back to her seat, the sheet music feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in her hands. Tyler leaned over and whispered, Wow, that looks crazy complicated. What did you do to make him mad at you? Maya forced a weak smile. I guess he thinks I can handle it. But as she sat in her chair looking at the music, Maya knew this wasn't about Professor Johnson believing in her abilities. This was about him making assumptions. He'd looked at her quiet demeanor, her thrift store clothes, and her admission of having no musical background, and decided to teach her a lesson about reaching too high. What he didn't know was that Maya had performed this exact piece when she was 12 years old. She'd played it at the International Youth Piano Competition in Vienna, where she'd taken second place. She remembered the way the audience had gasped during the most difficult passages, the way the judges had nodded their approval, the way her parents had beamed with pride afterward. But that was a lifetime ago. That was before everything fell apart. After class, Maya sat in her car in the parking lot staring at the sheet music. Part of her wanted to march back into Professor Johnson's office and tell him exactly who she used to be. She wanted to see the shock on his face when he realized his mistake. But she couldn't do that. Her carefully constructed new life depended on keeping her past buried. If people knew about her musical background, they would ask questions. They would want to know why she'd stopped playing, why she'd given up what many would consider a gift. Maya thought about her daughter Zoe waiting for her at home. At 16, Zoe was smart, independent, and had no idea that her mother had once been famous in classical music circles. Maya had worked hard to give her daughter a normal, stable life, free from the pressure and complications that had destroyed her own childhood. She folded the sheet music carefully and put it in her backpack. She would have to figure out how to handle this situation without revealing too much about herself. Maybe she could pretend to struggle with the piece, make deliberate mistakes, play it badly enough to maintain her cover but well enough to pass the class. But even as she thought this, Maya knew it would be almost impossible. The muscle memory was still there, buried but not gone. Playing the minute waltz badly would be like asking a native speaker to pretend they didn't know their own language. Maya started her car and drove toward the Rainbow Diner. She had the afternoon shift today, which meant she'd be serving lunch to the usual crowd of construction workers, retirees and students from the community college. As she drove, she found herself unconsciously humming the opening measures of the Chopin piece. The melody came back to her as naturally as breathing. She caught herself and stopped, gripping the steering wheel tighter. At the diner, Maya tied on her apron and grabbed her order pad. The lunch rush was always busy, which was good. Staying busy meant less time to think about pianos and sheet music and the complicated feelings they stirred up. Table 6 wants to know if we have any sugar-free pie, called Janet, the other waitress working the shift. Tell them we've got sugar-free apple, Maya replied, grabbing 2 plates of the daily special from the kitchen window. As she served customers and refilled coffee cups, Maya tried to push thoughts of the minute waltz out of her mind. But the music kept creeping back in, playing softly in the background of her thoughts like a radio she couldn't turn off. During her break, Maya sat in the diner's back room with a cup of coffee and pulled out the sheet music again. She traced the notes with her finger, remembering the feel of each passage. The piece was written in D-flat major, one of the most challenging keys for pianists because of all the black keys involved. She remembered her old teacher, Madame Volkov, explaining the proper fingering for the rapid scales that made the piece so difficult. She remembered practicing for hours, her young fingers flying across the keys until the complex patterns became second nature. Maya closed her eyes and could almost feel the keys beneath her fingertips. For just a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to make music, to bring those beautiful sounds to life. Then she opened her eyes and folded the music away again. That part of her life was over. She was just a waitress now, a single mom trying to finish school. She wasn't a pianist. She couldn't let herself be a pianist again. But as she went back to work, serving the afternoon customers their coffee and pie, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that Professor Johnson's assignment was going to force her to confront the part of herself she'd worked so hard to forget. The minute waltz was calling to her, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to resist its pull. That evening, Maya stood outside the door of her small apartment, key in hand but unable to bring herself to go inside. Through the thin walls, she could hear the faint sound of the old upright piano that sat in their tiny living room. Zoe was practicing her homework assignment from her high school music class, picking out a simple melody with one finger. Maya took a deep breath and opened the door. The sound of the piano hit her like a physical force, bringing back memories she'd buried so deep she sometimes forgot they existed. "Hey, Mom," Zoe called from the piano bench without turning around. "Mrs. Henderson gave us this super easy song to learn for music class. Want to hear it?" "Maybe later, honey," Maya said, hanging her jacket on the hook by the door. "I need to check on Grandma first." Maya walked down the short hallway to the bedroom where her mother, Rosa, spent most of her days. At 73, Rosa had developed arthritis that made moving around difficult, though her mind was still sharp as ever. "How was school today, mija?" Rosa asked, looking up from her crossword puzzle. "Fine, Mama. Just fine." Maya sat on the edge of the bed and helped her mother adjust her pillows. "Professor Johnson assigned our final projects today." Rosa studied her daughter's face. After 34 years, she could read Maya's expressions better than anyone. "What kind of project?" Maya hesitated. "We have to perform a piece of music on the piano." Rosa's eyebrows raised slightly. "Ah, and what piece did he give you?" "Something called the Minute Waltz, by Chopin." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken memories. Rosa had been there during Maya's childhood, had driven her to countless lessons and competitions, had watched her daughter's talent bloom and then watched it all fall apart. "That's a beautiful piece," Rosa said carefully. "Very challenging." Maya nodded, not trusting herself to say more. She kissed her mother's forehead and went to start dinner. In the kitchen, Maya could still hear Zoe at the piano, now attempting to play her simple song with both hands. The sound made Maya's chest tighten with a mixture of pride and pain. Zoe had inherited musical ability, but Maya had been careful never to encourage it too much. She'd seen what the pursuit of musical perfection could do to a child. As Maya chopped vegetables for dinner, her mind wandered back to when she was Zoe's age. But unlike her daughter's casual relationship with music, Maya's 16th year had been consumed by piano practice, competitions, and the crushing weight of everyone's expectations. She had been born Isabella Martinez then, not Maya Rodriguez. Isabella Martinez had been a prodigy, discovered at age 5 when she'd sat down at her grandmother's piano and played a complicated piece she'd heard on the radio. By age 8, she was performing with regional orchestras. By 12, she was competing internationally. Her parents, Carlos and Elena Martinez, had sacrificed everything for her career. They'd moved to New York so she could study with the best teachers. They'd spent their savings on lessons, sheet music, and travel to competitions. They'd arranged their entire lives around their daughter's talent. Maya remembered the pressure that had built over the years. The way her parents watched her practice, counting every mistake. The way her teacher, Madame Volkov, demanded perfection in every note. The way competition judges scrutinized her performances, looking for any flaw that might cost her first place. She remembered the schedule that had consumed her teenage years. 4 hours of practice before school, 2 hours after school, 6 hours on weekends, no time for friends, no time for normal teenage activities, no time to just be a kid. The breaking point had come during her junior year of high school. She was preparing for the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition, the most prestigious contest in the classical music world. The pressure to perform perfectly had become overwhelming. Maya paused in her chopping, her hand trembling slightly as she remembered that day. She'd been practicing the Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece that had made her famous at age 14, but something was different. Her fingers wouldn't cooperate. The music that had once flowed naturally became forced and mechanical. She'd practiced for 8 hours that day, becoming more frustrated with each attempt. Her parents and teacher kept pushing her, insisting she had to be perfect for the competition. Finally, something inside her had snapped. Maya remembered sitting at the piano bench looking at her hands and realizing she couldn't feel the music anymore. It had become nothing but notes on a page, technical exercises designed to impress judges. The joy, the passion, the pure love of making beautiful sounds had disappeared somewhere along the way. That night, she'd made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She announced that she was quitting piano. No more competitions, no more performances, no more pressure. She was done. Her parents had been devastated. They'd tried everything to change her mind: threats, bribes, guilt. Madame Volkov had called her ungrateful and foolish. The classical music community had whispered about the promising young pianist who'd thrown away her career. But Maya had been determined. At 17, she'd legally changed her name, moved across the country, and started over. She'd worked minimum wage jobs, put herself through community college, and eventually met David, Zoe's father. The marriage hadn't lasted long. David had wanted a traditional wife who would stay home and take care of the house, but Maya was too independent, too determined to build her own life. When Zoe was 2, they'd divorced, and Maya had been raising her daughter alone ever since. "Mom, dinner smells good," Zoe said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. "Can you help me with this piano thing after we eat?" "I can't get my left hand to work right." Maya's heart clenched. "Maybe you should ask your music teacher for help tomorrow." Zoe looked disappointed. "But you're here now. It would just take a minute." Maya focused on stirring the soup, avoiding her daughter's eyes. "I don't really know anything about piano, honey. Mrs. Henderson would be much better at helping you." It wasn't exactly a lie. Maya Rodriguez didn't know anything about piano. Isabella Martinez had known everything about piano, but that girl was gone. After dinner, Maya sat in her bedroom with the Chopin sheet music spread out on her small desk. She'd told Zoe and her mother that she was working on homework, which was technically true. Maya stared at the notes, and they stared back at her like old friends she'd tried to forget. The piece was exactly as she remembered it, elegant, challenging, full of the romantic passion that made Chopin one of the greatest composers who ever lived. She could hear every note in her head, could feel her fingers wanting to move through the familiar patterns. The muscle memory was still there, waiting beneath the surface of her carefully constructed ordinary life. Maya closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember what it felt like to play this piece. The way the melody soared and danced, the way the technical passages challenged her fingers to move faster than seemed possible, the way the audience would hold their breath during the most difficult sections. She remembered performing it at Carnegie Hall when she was 15. The spotlight had been hot on her face, the audience a sea of faces in the darkness beyond the stage. But when she'd started to play, everything else had disappeared. There had been only her, the piano, and Chopin's beautiful music. Maya opened her eyes and looked around her small bedroom with its thrift store furniture and secondhand decorations. This was her life now. This was the life she'd chosen when she'd walked away from Isabella Martinez and everything that name represented. She folded the sheet music and put it away in her desk drawer. Tomorrow she would have to figure out how to handle Professor Johnson's assignment without revealing who she really was. She would have to find a way to play the minute waltz badly enough to maintain her cover, but well enough to pass the class. But as she got ready for bed, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that trying to hide her musical abilities was going to be much harder than she'd thought. The music was still inside her, still part of who she was. No matter how hard she tried to deny it, and the minute waltz was calling to her, demanding to be played the way it was meant to be played, with passion, with skill, and with the technical mastery that only years of training could provide. Maya fell asleep that night with Chopin's melody playing in her dreams, and for the first time in years, she didn't try to make it stop. Maya stared at the piano in her living room for 3 days before she finally worked up the courage to lift the keyboard cover. The old upright had been in the apartment when she'd rented it 5 years ago. The landlord had said the previous tenant couldn't take it with them, and asked if Maya minded keeping it. She'd said yes, telling herself it was just furniture, just something to put plants and picture frames on. But now, with the Chopin sheet music tucked in her backpack and only 5 weeks left until her performance, Maya knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. She had to practice, even if it meant risking everything she'd worked so hard to build. It was Thursday evening. Zoe was at her friend Ashley's house working on a science project, and Rosa was napping in her bedroom. Maya had the living room to herself for the first time in weeks. She approached the piano like someone approaching a wild animal that might attack without warning. Her hands trembled as she lifted the wooden cover, revealing the black and white keys beneath. Some of the ivory was yellowed with age, and a few keys stuck slightly when pressed, but the instrument was still in decent condition. Maya sat on the old bench and adjusted its height, muscle memory guiding her movements even after all these years. She placed her hands over the keys without touching them, her fingers naturally falling into the proper curved position that Madame Volkov had drilled into her thousands of times. "Position, Isabella. Always watch your hand position." She could hear her old teacher's accented voice echoing in her memory. Maya took a deep breath and pressed middle C with her right thumb. The note rang out clear and true, filling the small apartment with sound. She quickly lifted her finger, looking around as if someone might have heard and come running to investigate. But the apartment remained quiet except for the soft sound of Rosa's snoring from the bedroom. Maya pressed the key again, this time letting the note sustain. She added the E above it, then the G, forming a simple C major chord. The harmony filled her with an emotion she'd forgotten existed, pure joy at making beautiful sounds. She played a simple scale, her fingers moving up and down the keys with practiced ease. It was like riding a bicycle after years of not cycling. Her body remembered what to do even when her mind tried to resist. After 20 minutes of basic exercises, Maya finally opened the Chopin sheet music. The notes seemed to leap off the page, familiar as an old friend's handwriting. She could hear the piece playing in her head, every ornament and grace note exactly as she remembered it. She started with just the opening melody, played slowly with her right hand. The beautiful waltz theme filled the room, elegant and romantic. Even at half speed, the music was recognizable, achingly lovely in its simplicity. Maya's left hand automatically moved to add the accompaniment pattern. The bass notes provided a steady rhythm while the melody danced above it. Without meaning to, she found herself increasing the tempo, her hands falling into the natural flow of the piece. "Mom." Maya's hands jerked away from the keys as if they'd been burned. She spun around to see Zoe standing in the doorway, her backpack still on her shoulders and her mouth hanging open in surprise. I was just," Maya stammered, her heart racing. "Your friend's mom dropped you off early?" Zoe stepped further into the room, her eyes wide with amazement. "Mom, I had no idea you could play like that. That sounded incredible. How long have you been taking lessons?" Maya's mind raced for an explanation that wouldn't reveal too much. "I'm not taking lessons. This is just for my music class. Professor Johnson assigned me this piece for my final project." Zoe moved closer to the piano, studying the sheet music with curiosity. "This looks really complicated. Are you sure you're supposed to play something this hard?" "The professor thinks I can handle it," Maya said, which was technically true, though not in the way Zoe would understand. "But Mom, you sounded like, that was really good. Like professional good." Zoe sat down next to her mother on the piano bench. "I've never heard you play anything before. Why didn't you tell me you knew how?" Maya felt trapped. She'd spent 16 years carefully constructing a life where she was just an ordinary single mom, with no particular talents or secrets. Now her daughter was looking at her with new eyes, seeing something Maya had tried desperately to keep hidden. "It's just something I'm learning for school," Maya said weakly. "It's not a big deal." But Zoe wasn't buying it. "Mom, that wasn't beginner playing. That was like the stuff they play on those classical music stations. You knew exactly what you were doing." Maya stood up from the bench, closing the sheet music. "I should get dinner started. Did you finish your science project?" Zoe grabbed her mother's arm gently. "Mom, wait. This is amazing. I had no idea you were so talented. Why do you act like it's nothing?" Maya looked into her daughter's bright, curious eyes and felt her carefully built walls starting to crumble. Zoe had always been smart, always able to see through Maya's attempts to deflect and change the subject. But this was different. This was dangerous territory. "Zoe, I need you to promise me something," Maya said, sitting back down and taking her daughter's hands. "Please don't tell anyone at school about this. Don't mention it to Ashley or your teachers or anyone else. Can you do that for me?" Zoe's expression grew confused. "Why? Mom, if you can play like that, why would you want to keep it a secret? It's incredible." Maya struggled to find words that would satisfy her daughter's curiosity without revealing the whole truth. Sometimes adults have complicated reasons for keeping parts of their past private. This is one of those times. "I just need you to trust me on this." "But Mom, please, Zoe, this is important to me." Zoe studied her mother's face, seeing something in her expression that made her nod reluctantly. "Okay, I won't tell anyone. But can I at least listen when you practice? I promise I won't bother you or ask questions. I'd like to hear you play." Maya felt her heart breaking and mending at the same time. Her daughter's genuine admiration and excitement were both wonderful and terrifying. "I don't know if that's a good idea. Please? I've been struggling with my piano homework for weeks, and Mrs. Henderson isn't a very good teacher. Maybe I could learn something just by watching you." Maya looked at the hope in her daughter's eyes and felt her resolve weakening. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to let Zoe listen occasionally. As long as she didn't ask too many questions or tell anyone else, it might actually be nice to share this part of herself with someone. "All right," Maya said finally, "but you have to promise to keep this between us. And if I ask you to leave while I'm practicing, you have to go without arguing." Zoe's face lit up with joy. "I promise. Can you play some more now? I want to hear how the rest of that piece goes." Maya hesitated, then opened the sheet music again. "Just for a few minutes. Then I really do need to start dinner." She placed her hands on the keys and began to play the minute waltz from the beginning. This time she didn't hold back as much, letting her muscle memory guide her through the familiar passages. The music flowed from her fingers with increasing confidence, the technical challenges melting away as her hands remembered their training. Zoe sat beside her in amazed silence, watching her mother's fingers dance across the keys with precision and grace. She'd never seen this side of her mother before, confident, skilled, completely absorbed in creating something beautiful. As Maya played, she felt something inside her beginning to wake up after years of sleep. The music was calling to parts of her soul she'd tried to forget, reminding her of who she used to be before life became about survival and responsibility. When she finished the piece, the apartment fell silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. "Mom," Zoe whispered, "that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Maya closed the sheet music and stood up from the bench, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Thank you, sweetheart. Now let's get some dinner started before Grandma wakes up." But as they walked to the kitchen together, Maya knew that something fundamental had shifted. She'd opened a door she'd kept locked for years and there was no going back. The music was awake inside her again, and no matter how hard she tried, she wouldn't be able to put it back to sleep. For the first time in years, Maya found herself looking forward to practicing. And that scared her more than anything else. Professor Johnson was running late to class, rushing across campus with his coffee and a stack of papers threatening to escape from under his arm. He'd been up until 2 in the morning grading midterm exams, and his usual punctuality had suffered for it. As he approached the music building, he could hear piano music drifting from one of the practice rooms. It wasn't unusual for students to practice before classes, but something about this particular playing made him slow his steps and listen more carefully. Someone was playing Chopin's Minute Waltz, and they were playing it beautifully. The technique was flawless, the interpretation sophisticated and mature. Professor Johnson paused outside the building, trying to identify which of his advanced students might be practicing so early in the morning. But when he checked his watch, he realized it wasn't that early. He was 15 minutes late for his music appreciation class. With a start, he hurried into the building and toward his classroom. "Sorry I'm late, everyone," he said as he burst through the door, setting his things down on the desk. "Traffic was terrible this morning." He looked around the room, taking attendance with his eyes. All of his music appreciation students were present, including Maya Rodriguez, who sat in her usual spot in the back corner. She looked the same as always, quiet, unassuming, focused on her notebook. Professor Johnson began his lecture on the Romantic period composers, but part of his mind kept returning to the beautiful Chopin performance he'd heard outside. The playing had shown such maturity and understanding of the music. It was the kind of interpretation that came from years of serious study. Halfway through the class, he decided to check on his students' progress with their final projects. "How is everyone coming along with their piano pieces?" he asked. "Any questions or concerns I should know about?" Tyler raised his hand. "Professor Johnson, I'm having trouble with the rhythm in Happy Birthday. Is there any chance I could switch to something even simpler?" "Keep working at it, Tyler. You have plenty of time to figure it out." Linda spoke up next. "I can play Mary Had a Little Lamb with one finger, but I'm nervous about performing in front of everyone. What if I forget how it goes?" "That's normal performance anxiety, Linda. The more you practice, the more confident you'll feel." Professor Johnson's eyes moved to Maya in the back corner.
"What about you, Maya?"
"How are you managing with the Chopin piece?" Maya looked up from her notebook, and for just a moment, Professor Johnson thought he saw something flash in her eyes. Confidence? Knowledge? It was gone so quickly he wondered if he'd imagined it. "It's challenging," Maya said quietly. "I'm working on it, but it's definitely harder than anything I've ever tried before." "Are you able to play through it at all, or are you still working on small sections?" Maya hesitated. "I can get through most of it now, but it's pretty rough. Lots of mistakes. Professor Johnson nodded, but something about her answer bothered him. There was a precision in the way she talked about the piece that seemed unusual for someone with no musical background. She used terms like working on sections and described her progress in a way that sounded more experienced than he would have expected. Well, keep at it, he said. Remember, I'm not expecting perfection. I just want to see that you understand the musical concepts we've been discussing. After class, Professor Johnson lingered in the hallway, watching his students file out. Maya was among the last to leave, gathering her things methodically as she always did. As she walked past him, he noticed something that made him do a double take: her hands. Now that he was paying attention, he could see that Maya's hands were different from what he'd expect from someone who'd never played piano. Her fingers were long and elegant, with calluses on the fingertips that suggested years of practice. Her nails were cut short and practical, exactly the way serious pianists kept theirs. "Maya," he called out as she reached the door. She turned back, and again he caught that flash of something in her eyes before she looked down. "Yes, Professor Johnson? I was wondering, when you said you had no musical background, did you mean no formal training? Sometimes people pick things up informally, play by ear, that sort of thing." Maya shifted her backpack on her shoulder. "No, sir. I really don't have any experience with music. That's why the Chopin piece is so difficult for me." Professor Johnson studied her face. She was clearly uncomfortable with his questions. But there was something else. She was being very careful with her words, very precise. It reminded him of how his advanced students talked when they were trying to downplay their abilities. "Of course," he said finally. "Well, let me know if you need any help. I'm always available during office hours." Maya nodded and hurried out of the classroom, leaving Professor Johnson alone with his growing suspicions. Over the next few days, Professor Johnson found himself paying closer attention to Maya during class discussions. When they talked about musical theory, she asked questions that showed a deeper understanding than she should have had. When he mentioned specific composers or pieces, he sometimes caught her nodding along in a way that suggested familiarity. Most telling of all, when he played recordings of classical pieces during class, he noticed that Maya often closed her eyes and moved her hands slightly, as if she were playing along. It was subtle, but once he started watching for it, he saw it happen repeatedly. During their discussion of Chopin's life and works, Maya had made a comment about the composer's use of rubato, the subtle speeding up and slowing down that gave his music its emotional expressiveness. It was an advanced concept that most music appreciation students never encountered, yet Maya had mentioned it casually, as if it were common knowledge. "Interesting point about rubato, Maya," Professor Johnson had said. "Where did you learn about that concept?" Maya had looked flustered. "I think I read it somewhere online when I was researching my piece." But Professor Johnson had been teaching long enough to recognize when a student was improvising an answer. Maya's knowledge of rubato hadn't come from internet research. It came from experience. The more he observed Maya, the more convinced Professor Johnson became that she was hiding something significant about her musical background. But why would someone pretend to be a beginner when they clearly had advanced knowledge? He started to think back to that morning when he'd heard the beautiful Chopin performance outside the building. The timing would have been right for it to be one of his music appreciation students. But which one? Tyler could barely manage Happy Birthday. Linda was struggling with Mary Had a Little Lamb. Patricia had some childhood training, but nothing that would prepare her for advanced repertoire. That left Maya, the quiet student in the back corner who claimed to have no musical experience, but asked questions that revealed sophisticated understanding. Professor Johnson found himself looking forward to Maya's final performance with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. If his suspicions were correct, he was about to discover that he'd seriously misjudged one of his students. But more than that, he was starting to realize that Maya's deception, if that's what it was, might not be malicious. There seemed to be something deeper going on. Some reason why a clearly talented musician would go to such lengths to hide her abilities. As he prepared his lessons for the following week, Professor Johnson decided to do a little research. If Maya Rodriguez had serious musical training, there might be some record of it. Competition results, recital programs, newspaper reviews. Serious musicians usually left some kind of paper trail. He spent his evening searching online databases and classical music websites, looking for any mention of Maya Rodriguez in connection with piano performance. He found nothing. But as he was about to give up, he decided to try a different approach. Instead of searching for Maya Rodriguez, he started looking for young pianists who had disappeared from the classical music scene in the past 20 years. Prodigies who had stopped competing, performers who had abandoned their careers, talented musicians who had simply vanished from the professional world. That's when he found the first mention of Isabella Martinez, a child prodigy who had been making waves in international competitions before, mysteriously withdrawing from the classical music world at age 17. Professor Johnson stared at the old competition photos on his computer screen. The girl in the pictures had different hair and was much younger, but there was something familiar about her eyes, her hand position at the piano, the elegant way she carried herself. He bookmarked the page and leaned back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle starting to come together in his mind. If Maya Rodriguez was really Isabella Martinez, then everything started to make sense. The hidden knowledge, the careful answers, the obvious discomfort with questions about her background. But it also raised new questions. Why had a promising young pianist abandoned her career? And why was she so determined to keep her identity secret now? Professor Johnson realized that Maya's final performance was going to be much more than a student project. It was going to be a revelation, whether she wanted it to be or not. The Minute Waltz would tell him everything he needed to know. The morning of the final performances arrived gray and drizzly, matching Maya's mood perfectly. She'd barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as she tried to figure out how to handle what was about to happen. For weeks she'd practiced the Minute Waltz in secret, her muscle memory taking over despite her best efforts to play it imperfectly. Maya sat at her kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. In 3 hours she would have to walk into that classroom and somehow play one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire while pretending to be a struggling beginner. "You're going to be amazing, Mom," Zoe said, grabbing an apple from the counter before heading to school. Over the past few weeks she'd become Maya's biggest supporter, sitting quietly in the living room during practice sessions and offering encouragement whenever Maya looked frustrated. "I just hope I don't embarrass myself," Maya replied, which was closer to the truth than Zoe could know. "Are you kidding? You play that piece better than anything I've ever heard on the radio. Professor Johnson is going to be so impressed." That was exactly what Maya was afraid of. After Zoe left for school, Maya went to check on her mother. Rosa was sitting up in bed, fully dressed and alert despite the early hour. "Today's the big day," Rosa said, studying her daughter's face with concern. "How are you feeling, Mia?" Maya sat on the edge of the bed. "Scared, Mama, really scared." Rosa took her daughter's hand. "Are you scared of playing the piano or scared of people knowing you can play the piano?" Maya had never been able to hide anything from her mother. Rosa had been there through all of it, the years of success, the breakdown, the decision to disappear from the music world. She understood better than anyone why Maya had built such high walls around her former identity. "Both," Maya admitted. "I don't know if I remember how to perform in front of people anymore. And I don't know what I'll do if Professor Johnson figures out who I really am." Rosa squeezed her hand. Isabella Martinez was a scared little girl who carried too much weight on her shoulders. But Maya Rodriguez is a strong woman who has built a good life for herself and her daughter. Maybe it's time to stop being afraid of the girl you used to be. Maya felt tears stinging her eyes. What if playing again brings back all the pressure? What if I can't control it this time either? Then you'll handle it the same way you've handled everything else for the past 17 years, Rosa said firmly. One day at a time with courage and grace. But hiding from your gifts isn't protecting you anymore, mija. It's just making you smaller. Maya kissed her mother's forehead and got ready for school, Rosa's words echoing in her mind. At the community college, Maya sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before she could bring herself to go inside. Her hands were shaking and she felt like she might throw up. She hadn't felt this nervous about a performance since she was 15 years old. The classroom was arranged differently than usual. Professor Johnson had moved all the desks to create a small performance area, with the old upright piano at the center. Maya's classmates were chatting nervously among themselves, sheet music clutched in their hands. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Johnson said as the last few students arrived. "I know some of you are nervous, but remember, this is a supportive environment. We're all here to learn and encourage each other." Maya noticed that Professor Johnson kept looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something different in his eyes today, a kind of anticipation that made her stomach clench with worry. Let's start with our simplest pieces and work our way up to the more challenging ones, Professor Johnson continued. Linda, would you like to go first? Linda shuffled to the piano bench, her hands visibly trembling. She played Mary Had a Little Lamb slowly and carefully with one finger, making several mistakes but managing to get through the entire melody. The class applauded warmly when she finished. Tyler went next with his version of Happy Birthday, played with basic chords in the left hand. He missed a few notes and lost the rhythm twice, but he smiled broadly when he was done, clearly proud of his accomplishment. Patricia performed her simplified arrangement of Amazing Grace with more confidence, her childhood lessons showing in her better hand position and smoother rhythm. She only made 2 small mistakes and received enthusiastic applause from her classmates. One by one, the other students performed their assigned pieces. Most were simple melodies that could be learned in a few weeks by dedicated beginners. All of them received warm encouragement from Professor Johnson and their fellow students. Maya watched each performance with growing dread. She was scheduled to go last, which meant she had to sit through everyone else's nervous but heartfelt attempts at making music, while knowing that her own performance would be completely different. And finally, Professor Johnson said when the other students had finished, "We have Maya Rodriguez performing Chopin's Minute Waltz." Maya walked to the piano on unsteady legs, acutely aware that every eye in the room was on her. She could hear whispers from her classmates. They all knew how difficult her assigned piece was compared to their own simple melodies. She sat on the bench and adjusted its height, her hands automatically moving into the proper position over the keys. For a moment, she considered playing the piece badly on purpose, making deliberate mistakes that would support her story of being a struggling beginner. But as she placed her fingers on the keys and felt their familiar weight and texture, something inside her rebelled against the idea of playing beautiful music poorly. The Minute Waltz deserved better than that. Chopin deserved better than that. Maya took a deep breath and began to play. The opening measures flowed from her fingers with crystalline clarity, each note precisely placed and perfectly timed. The familiar melody filled the classroom, elegant and romantic, played with the kind of technical control that came from years of serious training. Maya felt her body relaxing as the music took over. Her hands moved through the complex passages without conscious thought, guided by muscle memory and instinct. The rapid scales that made the piece so challenging cascaded effortlessly under her fingers, building to the dramatic climaxes with perfect timing and dynamics. She was no longer Maya Rodriguez, nervous community college student. She was Isabella Martinez again, lost in the pure joy of making beautiful music. The classroom, her classmates, even Professor Johnson faded away as she communicated directly with Chopin's brilliant composition. The piece demanded everything from a pianist: technical precision, emotional understanding, perfect timing, and the ability to make difficult passages sound effortless. Maya gave it everything, playing with the kind of passion and skill that had once made her famous. As she approached the final section, Maya realized she was no longer trying to hide her abilities. She was playing the Minute Waltz exactly as it was meant to be played, with all the artistry and technique she possessed. There was no going back now. The final measures rang out in the silent classroom, the last notes hanging in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Maya lifted her hands from the keys and sat perfectly still, afraid to look up and see the expressions on everyone's faces. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to be breathing. Finally, Maya raised her eyes and looked out at her classmates. Their faces showed a mixture of shock, awe, and confusion. Tyler's mouth was hanging open. Linda was staring at Maya as if she'd never seen her before. Patricia had tears running down her cheeks. But it was Professor Johnson's expression that made Maya's heart race with fear. He was looking at her with the kind of recognition that meant her secret was no longer secret. The applause, when it finally came, was thunderous and sustained. Her classmates rose to their feet one by one, giving her a standing ovation that went on for several minutes. But Maya barely heard it. She was focused on Professor Johnson, who was still staring at her with that knowing look in his eyes. When the applause finally died down and Maya returned to her seat, she knew that everything had changed. There would be questions now, investigations into her background, pressure to explain who she really was and why she'd been hiding. The performance that was supposed to help her blend in had instead made her stand out in the most dramatic way possible. Maya Rodriguez had just played herself out of existence, and Isabella Martinez was about to be reborn whether she wanted it or not. The classroom felt suffocating after Maya's performance ended. Students were still whispering among themselves, stealing glances at her with a mixture of amazement and confusion. Tyler kept shaking his head and muttering, "I can't believe we're in the same class." Linda was asking everyone if they had known Maya could play like that. Professor Johnson dismissed the class early, but he asked Maya to stay behind. "We need to talk," he said quietly as the other students filed out, still buzzing with excitement about what they'd just witnessed. Maya remained in her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like someone had just stripped away a disguise she'd been wearing for 17 years. The familiar walls of the classroom seemed to be closing in on her. "That was quite a performance," Professor Johnson said, moving to sit in the chair across from her. "In 25 years of teaching, I've rarely heard Chopin played with such technical mastery and artistic maturity." Maya stared at her hands. "I got lucky, I guess. I practiced really hard." Professor Johnson leaned forward slightly. "Maya, I don't think luck had anything to do with what I just heard. That kind of playing comes from years of serious training, decades even." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Maya could feel her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had dreaded it for weeks, but now that it was here, she felt paralyzed. "I've been doing some research," Professor Johnson continued gently, "about young pianists who disappeared from the classical music scene. Isabella Martinez was quite famous in competition circles before she suddenly stopped performing in 2008. She would be about your age now." Maya's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Professor Johnson's expression was kind, not accusatory. "I think you do. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, and I think you've been carrying this secret for a very long time." Maya felt tears beginning to well up in her eyes. After 17 years of hiding, of pretending to be someone else, of denying the most fundamental part of herself, she was exhausted. The weight of the secret had grown heavier with each passing year, and now it felt impossible to carry anymore. "Why did you stop?" Professor Johnson asked softly. "You had everything, talent, success, a promising career. What happened?" Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to find words for something she'd never talked about with anyone except her mother. "I broke," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The pressure just broke me." Professor Johnson waited patiently as Maya gathered her thoughts. "I was 17, she continued, the words coming slowly at first, then faster, as the dam of silence finally burst. "I'd been performing professionally since I was 8 years old. My parents had sacrificed everything for my career. My teacher demanded perfection in every note. The competition circuit was brutal, everyone watching for any sign of weakness, any mistake that might cost you first place." She paused, remembering the crushing weight of expectations that had built up over the years. "I was preparing for the Van Cliburn competition, which was supposed to be my big break into the adult professional world. But somewhere along the way I stopped hearing the music. It became just notes on a page, technical exercises designed to impress judges. The joy was gone." Professor Johnson nodded, understanding. "Performance anxiety? Burnout?" "More than that," Maya said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about things she'd kept buried for so long. "I had a complete breakdown. Panic attacks, insomnia, depression. I couldn't even touch a piano without feeling like I was suffocating. So I quit, cold turkey, changed my name, moved across the country, and started over. And you've been hiding ever since." Maya nodded. "I built a good life as Maya Rodriguez. I got married, had Zoe, took care of my mother. I thought I'd put Isabella Martinez behind me forever." Professor Johnson was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd told him. "But she was still there, wasn't she? Isabella was still part of who you are." "I tried to forget her," Maya admitted. "I tried to pretend that part of my life had never happened. But when you assigned me that piece when I started practicing again..." She trailed off, remembering the rush of emotion she'd felt when her hands first touched the keys after so many years. The music came flooding back. Professor Johnson finished. "Yes, like it had been waiting for me all this time. Professor Johnson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Maya, what you played today wasn't just technically impressive. It was deeply moving, full of emotion and artistry. That doesn't come from someone who's lost their connection to music. That comes from someone who understands it at the deepest level. Maya felt a fresh wave of tears threatening. But what if I can't control it this time? What if performing again brings back all the pressure and anxiety that destroyed me before? Then you'll handle it differently, Professor Johnson said firmly. You're not 17 anymore. You're not under the control of ambitious parents or demanding teachers. You're an adult who can make her own choices about how much or how little to engage with music. Maya looked up at him, surprised by his words. You think I should start performing again? Professor Johnson smiled. I think you should do whatever makes you happy. But I also think hiding from your gifts isn't serving you anymore. What you played today brought joy to everyone in this room. Music like that is meant to be shared, not buried. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Professor Johnson spoke again. I have a proposal for you. Next month, our college is hosting a small recital featuring community musicians. Nothing fancy, nothing high pressure. Just people who love music sharing their talents with friends and neighbors. Would you consider performing? Maya's first instinct was to say no, to run back to the safety of her carefully controlled life. But as she thought about how it had felt to play the Minute Waltz, to lose herself in Chopin's beautiful music, she found herself hesitating. I don't know, she said honestly. I'm scared. Of course you are. But fear doesn't have to be the thing that makes your decisions for you. Professor Johnson stood up and gathered his papers. Think about it. You don't have to give me an answer right now. But Maya, what you shared with us today was a gift. The world could use more beauty, more music, more of whatever it is that makes you play with such passion. After he left, Maya sat alone in the empty classroom for a long time. Through the windows, she could see students hurrying across campus, focused on their own lives and challenges. None of them knew that the quiet woman in music appreciation class had just faced the biggest moment of truth in 17 years. Maya thought about Zoe, who would be so proud when she heard about the performance. She thought about Rosa, who had been encouraging her to stop hiding from herself. She thought about the music that lived inside her, that had been waiting patiently for her to remember who she really was. Most of all, she thought about the look of pure joy on her classmates' faces when she'd played the Minute Waltz. For those few minutes, she'd given them something beautiful, something that had moved them and stayed with them. Maybe Professor Johnson was right. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid of Isabella Martinez and start figuring out how to integrate her back into Maya Rodriguez's life. The question was no longer whether she was a pianist. The question was what kind of pianist she wanted to be, and on whose terms she wanted to make music. For the first time in 17 years, Maya felt like she might actually have a choice in the matter. 3 weeks after her performance in Professor Johnson's class, Maya found herself standing backstage at the college's small auditorium. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of conversation from the audience gathering for the community recital. Her hands were trembling slightly, but it wasn't the paralyzing fear she remembered from her teenage years. This was different. Nervous excitement mixed with anticipation. She had decided to perform after all, though not without considerable soul-searching and long conversations with both Zoe and Rosa. Her daughter had been over the moon when Maya told her about Professor Johnson's invitation, and Rosa had simply smiled and said, "It's about time." Mija. Maya had chosen to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that was technically challenging but more intimate than the flashy Minute Waltz. It was music that spoke to her heart, music that she could pour her emotions into without feeling like she was performing tricks for judges. "You're going to be wonderful," said Linda, who was also performing tonight. She'd gotten so inspired by Maya's classroom performance that she'd asked Professor Johnson for a more challenging piece to work on. Tonight she would play Für Elise with both hands, something she never would have thought possible 3 months ago. "Thank you," Maya replied, adjusting the simple black dress she'd borrowed from Zoe. She'd refused Professor Johnson's suggestion to include her background as Isabella Martinez in the program notes. Tonight she was performing as Maya Rodriguez, community college student and single mother, not as a former child prodigy. From her spot in the wings, Maya could see the audience settling into their seats. The turnout was better than expected for a small community event. She spotted Zoe sitting in the front row next to Rosa, who had insisted on coming despite her arthritis. Professor Johnson was near the back, looking pleased with how the evening was shaping up. Maya Rodriguez, "You're up next," whispered the student volunteer managing the backstage area. Maya took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The auditorium held about 200 people, and tonight it was roughly half full. It felt intimate compared to the grand concert halls where Isabella Martinez had once performed. But somehow that made it more meaningful, not less. She sat at the piano bench and adjusted it to the proper height, her movements automatic after decades of muscle memory. The audience grew quiet, waiting for her to begin. Maya placed her hands over the keys and paused for a moment, remembering Professor Johnson's words about music being meant to be shared. She thought about her journey from Isabella to Maya, and back to something that was both and neither. She thought about the 17 years she'd spent hiding from this part of herself, and the courage it had taken to find her way back. Then she began to play. The nocturne flowed from her fingers like a conversation between old friends. The melody was achingly beautiful, full of the romantic longing that made Chopin's music so beloved. Maya felt herself settling into the music, finding that sweet spot where technique became invisible and only emotion remained. She played with maturity and depth that could only come from having lived through loss and rediscovery. The young Isabella Martinez had played with impressive technical skill, but Maya Rodriguez played with wisdom. She understood now what the music meant, not just how to execute it. The audience was completely silent, caught up in the spell of the beautiful melody. In the front row, Zoe watched her mother with tears of pride streaming down her face. Rosa closed her eyes and smiled, remembering the little girl who had first discovered her gift at her grandmother's piano so many years ago. As Maya played, she felt a sense of completeness she hadn't experienced in 17 years. This was who she was meant to be, not the pressure cooker prodigy of her youth, not the woman hiding from her gifts, but someone who could share beautiful music simply because the world needed more beauty in it. When the final notes faded away, the silence lasted for several heartbeats. Then the applause began, warm and genuine and sustained. Maya rose from the bench and took a simple bow, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. Later, as the audience mingled during the reception, Maya found herself surrounded by people who wanted to thank her for the performance. An elderly man told her that her playing had reminded him of his late wife, who had loved Chopin. A young mother asked if Maya gave piano lessons, saying her daughter had been inspired by the performance. "That was incredible," said Tyler, who had come to support his former classmate. "I can't believe we sat in the same music appreciation class for a whole semester, and I had no idea you could play like that." "Neither did I. For a while," Maya replied with a smile. Professor Johnson approached as the crowd began to thin out. "How does it feel to be performing again?" Maya considered the question seriously. "Different than before. Better, I think. When I was younger, performing felt like a test I had to pass. Tonight it felt like a gift I could give." "That's the difference between playing for others and playing for yourself," Professor Johnson said. "You've found your own relationship with music now, not the one other people tried to create for you." As the evening wound down, Maya helped clean up the auditorium alongside the other performers and volunteers. It felt good to be part of a community again, to contribute something meaningful without the weight of enormous expectations. Driving home with Zoe and Rosa, Maya reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. She was still Maya Rodriguez, still a single mother working her way through school and supporting her family. But she was also someone who could make beautiful music, someone who had gifts worth sharing. "So what happens now?" Zoe asked from the passenger seat. "Are you going to start performing regularly again?" Maya smiled. "I don't know yet. Maybe sometimes when the right opportunity comes along, but I'm not going to let music take over my life the way it did before. I have other priorities now." "Like what?" Rosa asked from the back seat, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Like being your mother," Maya said, reaching over to squeeze Zoe's hand. "Like taking care of you, Mama. Like living a balanced life where music is part of who I am, not the only thing I am." When they got home, Maya sat at the old upright piano in their living room. Without the pressure of an upcoming performance, she let her fingers wander over the keys, playing fragments of melodies that came to mind. Zoe curled up on the couch with her homework, occasionally looking up to listen to whatever her mother was playing. It occurred to Maya that this was exactly what she'd been looking for all those years ago when she'd run away from Isabella Martinez's life. Not the absence of music, but the presence of choice, the freedom to play when she wanted to, the way she wanted to, for reasons that made sense to her. She thought about Professor Johnson's community recital invitation and realized she probably would perform again when something spoke to her heart the way the nocturne had. But she would do it as Maya Rodriguez on her own terms in her own time. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Zoe answered it and handed it to her mother. It's someone from the local newspaper. They want to interview you about tonight's performance. Maya looked at the phone for a moment, then shook her head. Tell them thank you, but I'm not interested in interviews. Some parts of Isabella Martinez's life would stay in the past where they belonged. The pressure, the publicity, the constant scrutiny, none of that had ever brought her joy. But the music itself, the pure act of creating beauty and sharing it with others, that was worth keeping. That was worth integrating into Maya Rodriguez's carefully balanced life. As she tucked Zoe into bed that night, her daughter asked, Mom, are you happy you played tonight? Maya considered the question carefully. Yes, sweetheart. I think I am. Good, Zoe said sleepily. I like seeing you happy. Maya turned off the light and went to check on Rosa, who was already asleep with a peaceful smile on her face. Then she returned to the living room and sat at the piano one more time. She played softly, so as not to wake anyone, letting her fingers find their way through a simple melody that seemed to capture everything she was feeling. Relief, gratitude, hope, and something that might have been peace. Maya Rodriguez had found her way back to the music, but more importantly, she'd found a way to let the music be part of her life without letting it consume her life. Isabella Martinez had been reborn, but not as she was before. She was something new now, something better. A woman who could choose when and how to share her gifts, free from the expectations of others and true to herself. The melody continued to flow from her fingers as the night settled around her small apartment, carrying with it the promise of a future where music and life could coexist in perfect, chosen harmony.